There's a moment in some people's lives when they realize they've become invisible, not to strangers, but to the ones who know them best. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, through jokes that land a little too sharp, through decisions made without asking, through the unspoken assumption that your best years are already behind you. This is not a story about revenge. There are no raised voices here, no dramatic confrontations. It's a story about what happens when someone stops asking to be seen and starts choosing themselves instead. About building something meaningful in silence, and about the moment the world finally looks your way, only to discover that validation is no longer required. Because dignity doesn't announce itself, it waits, and when it moves, it does so on its own terms. Before we start the story, please tell me about the story in the end, or wherever you left. Just tell me why you are leaving, what you want me to improve about the stories, even if you don't like the story. Just let me know why you don't like the story. I will be very thankful to you. Now let's move towards the story. Margaret learned she had become unnecessary on an ordinary Tuesday evening. It wasn't announced. No one said the words out loud. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no cruelty sharp enough to protest. Period. It revealed itself quietly, the way dust settles on furniture that hasn't been used in a while. They were sitting around the dining table, her husband, her adult children, the familiar clatter of plates and half-finished conversations filling the room. Margaret listened more than she spoke these days, not because she had nothing to say, but because interruptions had become so common that silence felt more economical. She watched as decisions were made without her. A weekend plan, a financial discussion, a casual remark about how things used to work. Each sentence moved forward as if she were an object in the room, rather than a person at the table. When she did speak, her words were met with polite nods, the kind given to someone indulged, not consulted. Her daughter smiled and said, "That's sweet, Mom," the way one might respond to a suggestion already dismissed. Margaret smiled back. She had learned how to do that convincingly. Later that night, she stood alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes no one had asked her to wash. The house was full, yet it felt strangely hollow. She caught her reflection in the darkened window, silver threaded through her hair, posture still straight, eyes observant. She did not look broken, but she did look unseen. Margaret had spent decades being essential. She had been the keeper of schedules, the solver of problems, the quiet force that kept life moving without friction. Somewhere along the way, that competence had been reclassified as irrelevance, not because she failed, but because she no longer fit the story others wanted to tell about themselves. The world had shifted, and no one thought to tell her. The realization didn't wound her the way she might have expected. It settled instead, heavy and unmistakable, like a truth finally allowed to surface. She wasn't needed here, not in the way she once was. That night, Margaret didn't cry. She didn't confront anyone or replay conversations in her mind. She simply lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of a household moving around her without consideration. And for the first time in her life, she asked herself a question she had never needed before. If no one was watching, who would she choose to be? The following weeks passed with a peculiar clarity. Margaret noticed patterns she had been too busy to observe before. How her presence was acknowledged only when convenient. How her absence went unnoticed. How her advice was accepted only after someone else rephrased it. She stopped offering reminders, stopped correcting small mistakes, stopped smoothing over moments of discomfort. Nothing collapsed. Life continued effortlessly without her intervention. And that, more than anything, confirmed what she had already sensed. So Margaret began doing something quietly radical. She reclaimed her time. At first, it was small. Morning walks, taken without explanation. Afternoons spent at the public library, seated near tall windows where sunlight spilled across old wooden tables. She read things she had once postponed: history, philosophy, essays written by people who had lived entire lives without seeking approval. There was a comfort in anonymity. No expectations, no assumptions, no one asking her to perform a role she had outgrown. She enrolled in a community course under her maiden name, not to hide, but to exist without history attached. The classroom was filled with people of all ages, each carrying their own private motivations. No one looked at her with familiarity. No one reduced her to what she had been. They listened when she spoke. Margaret realized how long it had been since that happened. Slowly, something shifted inside her. A sense of alignment she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't reinventing herself. She was returning to something intact that had simply been ignored. At home, her absence from emotional labor went largely unnoticed. Her family interpreted her quiet as contentment. They assumed comfort where there was simply distance. Margaret allowed the misunderstanding. She was no longer interested in correcting narratives that didn't serve her. What she built next wasn't visible. There were no announcements, no dramatic transformations, just consistency. Purpose has a way of growing roots when left undisturbed. And somewhere beyond the walls of the home that had dismissed her, Margaret began laying the foundation for a life that required no validation to sustain it. She did not yet know who would notice. She only knew that when they did, it would be too late to ask her to return to the background. Margaret did not announce her withdrawal. She understood instinctively that meaning built in silence was sturdier than anything constructed in defiance. There was no satisfaction in being misunderstood loudly. If she was going to change her life, she would do it without explanation. The mornings became hers first. She began waking before the rest of the house, moving through the quiet with deliberate care. The kettle, the window, the slow ritual of preparing herself for the day. These moments felt newly significant. They were not rushed. They were not interrupted. No one noticed the shift. At breakfast, her family continued their routines. Phones buzzed. Schedules overlapped. Conversations revolved around obligations that no longer included her. Margaret listened without resentment. Distance, she was learning, did not require bitterness. It required boundaries. She stopped volunteering information about her plans. When asked casually where she was going, she offered neutral answers. Out for a while. Running errands. Statements that closed the door gently, without challenge. The freedom was subtle, but intoxicating. At the library, Margaret found a corner desk that felt as if it had been waiting for her. It sat beneath a tall window, overlooking a courtyard where leaves gathered in quiet patterns. She claimed the same seat each afternoon, unpacking her notebooks with intention. She was not there to pass time. She was there to build. Years ago, Margaret had abandoned certain interests because they were impractical. Writing, research, mentorship. She had folded those curiosities neatly away in favor of responsibilities that promised stability. Now, with no one asking anything of her, those interests resurfaced naturally. She began outlining ideas, projects she had once imagined but never pursued, programs that addressed gaps she had observed for decades, systems that made sense to her in ways they never had to anyone else. Her mind felt sharp, not youthful, not nostalgic, simply capable. Margaret registered for additional courses, expanding beyond the single class she had first joined. She learned new technologies, updated methodologies, unfamiliar frameworks. The learning curve was steep, but she welcomed it. Difficulty felt honest. It demanded attention without judgment. Her instructors treated her as a peer. Her classmates listened when she spoke. That alone was transformative. At home, her absence grew more noticeable, but not concerning. Her family interpreted her independence as a phase, a harmless hobby filling time that might otherwise feel empty. No one asked what she was working on. No one expressed curiosity. Margaret did not offer explanations. She had learned that interest requested carried more weight than interest imposed. Instead, she refined her focus. She volunteered her expertise quietly, offering consultation to organizations that valued experience without spectacle. Her contributions were welcomed. Her insights respected. Invitations came not because she demanded recognition, but because her work spoke clearly. Margaret remembered something she had once known and forgotten. Purpose does not need permission. As weeks turned into months, the structure of her days solidified. She balanced learning with contribution, solitude with connection. Her life felt full in a way it hadn't in years, not crowded, but aligned. At home, the dynamic shifted subtly. Her husband noticed first. He commented on her absences with mild curiosity, asked where she had been spending her time. Margaret answered calmly, without defensiveness. She shared selectively, offering facts without emotional investment. "I've been busy," she said once, simply. He nodded, accepting the explanation without probing further. The children noticed later. They remarked on her changed availability, on dinners missed, on conversations shortened. Margaret responded with warmth, but not accommodation. She did not rearrange her commitments to reassure them. The shift unsettled them, though they could not articulate why. Margaret recognized the discomfort. She had disrupted a familiar pattern. Previously, her presence had been constant and predictable, her needs minimal, her attention always accessible. Now she existed independently of their awareness. This independence altered the balance. Margaret did not apologize. She understood now that her previous availability had not been generosity. It had been erasure disguised as service. One evening, while reviewing notes at her desk, Margaret received an email that stopped her mid-sentence. An organization she had quietly assisted invited her to participate in a larger initiative. Her role would be advisory, her experience central to the project's direction. They had found her through word of mouth. Someone had recommended her. The validation surprised her, not because it felt undeserved, but because she realized she no longer required it. She accepted the invitation with professionalism, not excitement. The work itself mattered more than the recognition attached to it. As her involvement deepened, so did her sense of clarity. She understood her value with a steadiness that did not fluctuate with others' opinions. It was not confidence fueled by praise. It was confidence rooted in competence. Margaret moved through her days with quiet assurance. She dressed differently, not for attention, but for comfort. She spoke less at home, but with greater intention. She conserved energy that had once been spent maintaining harmony at her own expense. The house adapted. Schedules adjusted. Life continued. And still, no one fully noticed the extent of her transformation. That realization brought her neither disappointment nor relief. It brought her peace, because Margaret was no longer building a life to be observed. She was building one that functioned, regardless of who was watching. The foundation was solid, the direction clear. And though she did not yet know how visible her work would become, she knew this with certainty. When recognition arrived, it would find her standing, not waiting. Margaret had always believed that if she ever stepped back, someone would notice immediately. That belief turned out to be incorrect. At first, her absence moved through the household like a draft, felt but dismissed as temporary. Missed dinners were attributed to errands, shortened conversations explained away by fatigue. Her reduced presence registered only as a minor inconvenience. Then the inconveniences accumulated. Small things began to surface. Bills overlooked, appointments misremembered, assumptions left unconfirmed. The quiet systems Margaret had once maintained without acknowledgement began to falter. No crisis followed, just friction. The family adjusted in clumsy increments, compensating without naming the source of the change. They spoke to one another with mild irritation, puzzled by the effort required to maintain a rhythm that had once felt effortless. Margaret observed without comment. She was careful not to intervene reflexively. Each time she noticed a task left undone, a question unanswered, she paused, asked herself whether involvement was necessary or simply habitual. Most of the time, it was the latter. So she let the moments pass. At workspaces beyond the home, her presence continued to expand. The advisory role she had accepted grew in scope. Her insights shaped discussions that carried real consequence. Meetings ended with requests for her input, not as an afterthought, but as a central consideration. Margaret felt the contrast acutely. In one space, she was optional. In another, essential. The realization was clarifying rather than painful. It taught her where her energy belonged. At home, curiosity eventually replaced assumption. Her husband asked more direct questions: where she was going, what she was working on, how long she planned to be out. The inquiries carried a tone Margaret recognized, uncertain, slightly unsettled. She answered honestly, but briefly. "I have commitments," she said once, fastening her coat with calm precision. He nodded, absorbing the response as though it were new information. The children responded differently. They noticed not only her absence, but her composure when present. She no longer hovered, no longer anticipated needs before they were expressed. She listened without filling silences. The change was disorienting. One evening, her daughter remarked, "You seem busy lately." Margaret met her gaze, expression neutral. "I am." The conversation ended there. Margaret understood something then. They did not miss her presence. They missed her availability. And those were not the same thing. As weeks passed, the imbalance became more apparent. Family discussions slowed without Margaret's mediation. Decisions took longer. Consensus felt harder to reach. Her absence had removed a stabilizing force they had never named. Still, no one apologized. No one acknowledged the shift directly. Margaret did not expect them to. Recognition often arrived late, if at all. Meanwhile, the world beyond the household continued to respond. Her work gained visibility. Her name circulated in professional spaces she had once observed from a distance. Invitations arrived without solicitation. Her perspective was sought. Her experience treated as an asset rather than an artifact. Margaret remained measured. She did not share updates at home, not out of secrecy, but because the impulse to justify herself had dissolved. Her life did not require translation. One afternoon, she returned home earlier than expected and overheard a conversation not meant for her. Her husband and son spoke quietly in the living room, their voices edged with uncertainty. They discussed responsibilities, Margaret used to manage, the logistics of an upcoming obligation. The assumption, spoken now with doubt, that she would handle it. Margaret paused in the hallway. She listened. Then she walked past them without interruption, moving calmly toward her study. They fell silent. Later, her husband approached her with a question phrased carefully, as though navigating unfamiliar ground. "Will you be able to help with this weekend?" Margaret considered the request. She could have said yes reflexively. She could have rearranged her plans. She could have restored the old equilibrium. Instead, she said no. The word was not sharp. It was not defensive. It was simply complete. He hesitated, surprised. "Oh, I thought. Were to. That was someone. You always did that too. You helped," Margaret signified, and made it without resolution. It was mind-blowing, knowing her sorrow did not stop her. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. Margaret's life was no longer structured around filling gaps others neglected to acknowledge. It was structured around intention. Gradually, her family adapted, not with grace, but with necessity. Roles shifted. Expectations recalibrated. The household learned to function without assuming her constant presence. They spoke of her differently now. Not dismissively, but cautiously, as if unsure where she fit. Margaret did not correct the uncertainty. She allowed it to exist. Because uncertainty, she had learned, often preceded respect. Outside the home, her work reached a threshold. A public acknowledgement loomed, an invitation that would bring visibility she had neither sought nor avoided. Margaret received the notice quietly, reading it alone at her desk. She closed the email without reaction. Visibility was not the goal. Alignment was. She understood now that when the world finally noticed her, the decision would not be whether to accept recognition, but how much of herself she was willing to offer in return. And for the first time, that decision would be entirely hers. The invitation arrived without ceremony. Margaret read it once, then again, absorbing its implications slowly. The language was formal, precise, unmistakably respectful. Her experience was not mentioned as a footnote. It was the foundation. She closed her laptop and sat back in her chair. This was the moment she had once imagined, years earlier, when ambition still felt urgent and recognition seemed synonymous with relevance. Back then, she might have felt exhilaration, anxiety, a need to prove herself worthy of being seen. Now she felt something else. Stillness. Margaret accepted the invitation with measured clarity. She did not overthink the decision. She did not seek reassurance. She simply agreed to participate as one professional among others, bringing what she knew and leaving the rest behind. The first public meeting was held in a neutral space. Glass walls, clean lines. The quiet hum of intention. Margaret arrived early, as she always did, choosing a seat that offered both perspective and distance. When the discussion began, it became clear she was not there to observe. Questions were directed to her almost immediately. Clarifications requested. This was not new territory. It was recognition catching up to reality. When the meeting concluded, several participants approached her. They thanked her, asked follow-up questions, expressed interest in future collaboration. Margaret acknowledged each interaction with courtesy. She did not mistake attention for intimacy. At home, the timing of her visibility coincided with a subtle shift in tone. Her family noticed her schedule now, noticed her departures, her preparation, the way she moved through the house with intention rather than availability. They asked questions framed with curiosity rather than assumption. "Where are you going today? What are you working on?" Margaret answered without elaboration. The imbalance unsettled them. They had grown accustomed to a version of her that oriented itself around their needs. This version did not. One evening, her husband remarked, "You seem different." Margaret considered the statement. "I am," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, no invitation to debate, just acknowledgement. He nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Margaret understood his hesitation. Change, when it does not ask permission, often feels threatening to those who benefited from the previous arrangement. She did not attempt to soothe the discomfort. She had spent enough years managing emotions that were not her responsibility. As her professional commitments expanded, so did her visibility. Not in a performative sense, but in presence. Her name appeared in correspondence. Her recommendations shaped outcomes. Her involvement became expected rather than exceptional. Margaret observed the shift with detachment. She was not intoxicated by recognition. She was insulated from it. The insulation came from knowing who she was before anyone acknowledged her. At home, the dynamic reached a quiet inflection point. Her daughter mentioned an upcoming family event, speaking as though Margaret's attendance were assumed. Margaret listened, then said calmly, "I won't be available that day." The silence that followed was unfamiliar. "Oh," her daughter said after a moment. "We thought—" "I have prior commitments," Margaret replied. The conversation moved on, but the air remained altered. Margaret recognized the tension. It was the sound of expectations being recalibrated. That night, she reflected on how often she had once chosen harmony over honesty. How easily she had absorbed inconvenience to preserve ease for others. The cost had not been obvious at the time. Now it was, and she was no longer willing to pay it. Margaret's work reached beyond advisory roles. Her contributions influenced broader initiatives. Her perspective, rooted in lived experience rather than theory, filled gaps others had overlooked. She was invited to speak, not as a symbol, but as a resource. Margaret prepared thoughtfully, declining engagements that felt performative. She accepted those aligned with substance. Her criteria were simple: respect, relevance, and restraint. Visibility, she had learned, was only valuable when it served purpose. When she spoke publicly for the first time, she did so without spectacle. No personal narrative, no appeal for sympathy, just clarity. The audience responded with attentiveness rather than applause. Margaret preferred it that way. At home, the contrast became undeniable. Her family watched her leave with a composure they had not anticipated. She was not seeking approval. She was not compensating for absence. She existed independently of their recognition. The realization unsettled them. Margaret did not confront it. She allowed the discomfort to mature on its own, because dignity, she had learned, did not require explanation. It required consistency. And consistency, once established, spoke louder than any defense. Margaret moved forward with steady resolve, fully aware that the world's attention, when it arrived, did not belong to her past. It belonged to the life she had built quietly, without permission. The invitation arrived without ceremony. Margaret read it once, then again, absorbing its implications slowly. The language was formal, precise, unmistakably respectful. Her experience was not mentioned as a footnote. It was the foundation. She closed her laptop and sat back in her chair. This was the moment she had once imagined, years earlier, when ambition still felt urgent and recognition seemed synonymous with relevance. Back then, she might have felt exhilaration, anxiety, a need to prove herself worthy of being seen. Now she felt something else. Stillness. Margaret accepted the invitation with measured clarity. She did not overthink the decision. She did not seek reassurance. She simply agreed to participate as one professional among others, bringing what she knew and leaving the rest behind. The first public meeting was held in a neutral space. Glass walls, clean lines. The quiet hum of intention. Margaret arrived early, as she always did, choosing a seat that offered both perspective and distance. When the discussion began, it became clear she was not there to observe. Questions were directed to her almost immediately. Clarifications requested. This was not new territory. It was recognition catching up to reality. When the meeting concluded, several participants approached her. They thanked her, asked follow-up questions, expressed interest in future collaboration. Margaret acknowledged each interaction with courtesy. She did not mistake attention for intimacy. At home, the timing of her visibility coincided with a subtle shift in tone. Her family noticed her schedule now, noticed her departures, her preparation, the way she moved through the house with intention rather than availability. They asked questions framed with curiosity rather than assumption. "Where are you going today? What are you working on?" Margaret answered without elaboration. The imbalance unsettled them. They had grown accustomed to a version of her that oriented itself around their needs. This version did not. One evening, her husband remarked, "You seem different." Margaret considered the statement. "I am," she said. There was no accusation in her voice, no invitation to debate, just acknowledgement. He nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Margaret understood his hesitation. Change, when it does not ask permission, often feels threatening to those who benefited from the previous arrangement. She did not attempt to soothe the discomfort. She had spent enough years managing emotions that were not her responsibility. As her professional commitments expanded, so did her visibility. Not in a performative sense, but in presence. Her name appeared in correspondence. Her recommendations shaped outcomes. Her involvement became expected rather than exceptional. Margaret observed the shift with detachment. She was not intoxicated by recognition. She was insulated from it. The insulation came from knowing who she was before anyone acknowledged her. At home, the dynamic reached a quiet inflection point. Her daughter mentioned an upcoming family event, speaking as though Margaret's attendance were assumed. Margaret listened, then said calmly, "I won't be available that day." The silence that followed was unfamiliar. "Oh," her daughter said after a moment. "We thought—" "I have prior commitments," Margaret replied. The conversation moved on, but the air remained altered. Margaret recognized the tension. It was the sound of expectations being recalibrated. That night, she reflected on how often she had once chosen harmony over honesty. How easily she had absorbed inconvenience to preserve ease for others. The cost had not been obvious at the time. Now it was, and she was no longer willing to pay it. Margaret's work reached beyond advisory roles. Her contributions influenced broader initiatives. Her perspective, rooted in lived experience rather than theory, filled gaps others had overlooked. She was invited to speak, not as a symbol, but as a resource. Margaret prepared thoughtfully, declining engagements that felt performative. She accepted those aligned with substance. Her criteria were simple: respect, relevance, and restraint. Visibility, she had learned, was only valuable when it served purpose. When she spoke publicly for the first time, she did so without spectacle. No personal narrative, no appeal for sympathy, just clarity. The audience responded with attentiveness rather than applause. Margaret preferred it that way. At home, the contrast became undeniable. Her family watched her leave with a composure they had not anticipated. She was not seeking approval. She was not compensating for absence. She existed independently of their recognition. The realization unsettled them. Margaret did not confront it. She allowed the discomfort to mature on its own, because dignity, she had learned, did not require explanation. It required consistency. And consistency, once established, spoke louder than any defense. Margaret moved forward with steady resolve, fully aware that the world's attention, when it arrived, did not belong to her past. It belonged to the life she had built quietly, without permission. Recognition arrived the way it often does, awkwardly and too late. Margaret sensed the shift before anyone named it. The glances lingered longer. Questions carried an unfamiliar caution. Her family had begun to notice not just her absence, but the space it created. They were adjusting, slowly, to a reality in which she no longer filled the gaps automatically. The first overt attempt at re-engagement came disguised as nostalgia. Her husband mentioned a tradition they used to share, a casual suggestion framed as memory rather than request. Margaret listened, recognizing the strategy for what it was, a gentle pull toward familiarity. She responded kindly, but without commitment. "That sounds nice," she said, and left it there. He hesitated, uncertain how to proceed without the unspoken assumption of her compliance. Later, her daughter approached her with a different tone. Less casual, more deliberate. She asked about Margaret's work, her schedule, her interests. The questions felt rehearsed, as though curiosity had been summoned rather than spontaneous. Margaret answered honestly, without embellishment. The conversation stalled when it became clear that understanding would require effort. Margaret did not bridge the gap. She understood now that attention offered only after withdrawal was not reconciliation, it was reaction. It was reaction. As the world beyond the home continued to respond to her contributions, the contrast sharpened, invitations multiplied. Her calendar filled with work that respected her boundaries and recognized her expertise without entitlement. Margaret accepted selectively. She no longer measured opportunity by visibility, but by alignment. One afternoon, she returned home to find her husband waiting for her in the living room. He sat forward, hands clasped, posture tentative. The conversation he initiated was careful, almost formal. "You've changed," he said. Margaret met his gaze steadily. Yes. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no challenge, just confirmation. He searched her face, perhaps for reassurance that the change did not exclude him. That hope remained, that she would recalibrate herself around the household again. Margaret did not offer that reassurance. "I didn't realize how much you were doing," he said, after a pause. Margaret nodded. Most people don't. The admission hung between them, not accusatory, but irrevocable. He continued, speaking of balance, of missed cues, of assumptions made without intention. His words carried sincerity, but also distance. They were explanations, not accountability. Margaret listened without interruption. When he finished, she responded carefully. "I'm not angry," she said, "but I'm not available in the same way anymore." He absorbed the statement slowly. This was the moment he understood, not fully, but enough. The version of Margaret he had relied upon was not returning. The conversation ended without resolution. Margaret returned to her study, the boundary intact. Her children followed with their own attempts, more fragmented, less direct. Invitations extended with an undercurrent of uncertainty. Offers of help, phrased as concern. Margaret accepted none of it automatically. She chose intentionally. The shift unsettled them. They had mistaken her consistency for permanence. Margaret understood how easy that mistake was to make. She had once made it herself. Outside the home, recognition escalated in ways Margaret had not predicted. Her work was cited publicly, her name attached to initiatives gaining traction. She was approached by individuals who spoke to her as an authority, not a supporting character. The attention was measured. So was her response. Margaret did not inflate herself to meet expectations. She remained precise, grounded, selective. Her boundaries were not defensive. They were structural. The world adjusted accordingly. At home, the recalibration continued. Family gatherings grew quieter. Roles were redistributed. Her absence from decision-making forced others to engage more deliberately. Margaret observed the adaptation with neutrality. She did not derive satisfaction from their discomfort. She derived clarity. One evening, her daughter asked a question that marked a turning point. "Are you happy?" she asked. Margaret considered the word. Happiness had once meant approval, belonging, being needed. Now it meant something else. Yes, she said. Pause. I am. The answer surprised them both. As her work reached a visible milestone, a public acknowledgement that could not be ignored, Margaret prepared herself not for the recognition, but for the reaction it would provoke at home. She anticipated curiosity, perhaps pride, possibly regret. She did not anticipate needing to manage any of it. When the acknowledgement occurred, it was understated. A formal mention, a quiet commendation. No spectacle. Margaret appreciated the restraint. At home, the news landed with mixed emotions. Her husband read the notice twice, then looked at her with a new expression, something between admiration and uncertainty. Her children responded with congratulations that felt sincere, if slightly belated. Margaret accepted the words politely. She did not fill the silence with reassurance. She did not shrink to make them comfortable. She did not expand to meet their expectations. She remained where she was. Later that night, alone in her study, Margaret reflected on the path that had led her here. The quiet construction, the deliberate withdrawal, a dignity maintained without announcement. Recognition had arrived, but it had not changed her course. Margaret understood now that the most powerful choice she had made was not stepping into visibility, but deciding what she would not trade for it. And that decision would guide her forward, regardless of who was watching. Margaret received the offer late in the evening, when the world felt briefly paused. She read the message once, then again, noting the careful phrasing. The opportunity was significant. Expanded influence, broader visibility, a role that carried both authority and prestige. It was framed as a natural progression, a recognition of her growing impact. Years ago, she might have accepted immediately. Now, she closed her laptop and sat quietly, allowing the implications to settle. The offer came with expectations, public presence, increased availability, a subtle erosion of the boundaries she had worked deliberately to establish. It promised validation, but at a cost she now understood clearly. Margaret did not feel flattered. She felt curious. She spent the next days considering the proposal, not in isolation, but in context, how it would shape her time, how it would alter the work she valued, how it might shift her sense of alignment. She consulted no one at home. The decision belonged solely to her. At the household, the atmosphere continued its slow recalibration. Conversations remained cautious, respectful, occasionally strained. Her family had accepted, at least outwardly, that she was no longer perpetually available. They were learning to navigate the space she had reclaimed. One afternoon, her husband mentioned the offer casually. He had heard about it through social channels, the news traveling faster than personal conversation. "You could do a lot with that," he said, attempting neutrality. Margaret acknowledged the comment without commitment. "I'm considering it," she replied. He nodded, then hesitated. "It would be good for us." Margaret looked at him steadily. For me, she corrected gently. The distinction lingered between them. That evening, she returned to her study and reviewed the details again. The role required visibility she had never sought. It also carried influence that could amplify the work she cared about. Margaret understood the paradox. Opportunity often arrived disguised as obligation. She imagined herself accepting, attending events, managing expectations, negotiating perceptions. She also imagined declining, continuing her work quietly, without the added weight of performance. Neither option frightened her. Only one felt honest. Margaret drafted a response, then deleted it. She needed more time, not to decide, but to listen inwardly. She took a long walk the next morning, moving through familiar streets with measured steps. She noticed the rhythm of the city, the anonymity it offered. No one recognized her. No one expected anything. The freedom was instructive. She thought about the version of herself her family had once dismissed. The woman considered obsolete, whose relevance was assumed to have expired quietly. That woman had built something real. Not for recognition, not for validation, but for purpose. Margaret understood now that the offer was not a reward. It was a test. Would she return to a version of herself shaped by external expectation, or remain grounded in the life she had constructed deliberately? She returned home with clarity. Margaret declined the offer. Her response was respectful, concise, unapologetic. She expressed gratitude, then stated her intention to continue contributing in ways aligned with her priorities. The reply came quickly, expressing understanding and admiration. Margaret closed the exchange without second thought. The decision did not feel like refusal. It felt like authorship. At home, the news of her choice elicited surprise. "You turned it down?" her daughter asked, incredulous. "Yes," Margaret said. "Why?" her son asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Because I don't need it," she replied. The statement unsettled them. They had assumed success required accumulation, more visibility, more authority, more validation. Margaret's choice challenged that assumption. Her husband observed quietly. Later, he approached her with a question less guarded than before. "Are you afraid of stepping back?" he asked. Margaret met his gaze calmly. "No," she said. "I'm afraid of stepping away from myself." The honesty shifted something between them. Not resolution, not reconciliation, but recognition. Margaret's life continued with steady momentum. Her work retained its depth, her influence its quiet reach. She contributed where it mattered, withdrew where it didn't. She no longer explained her decisions. She lived them. The family adjusted further, learning that her presence was no longer guaranteed by proximity. They approached her differently now, with respect tinged by uncertainty. Margaret accepted the change without resistance. She understood that dignity did not require affirmation. It required choice, and she had made hers. The applause came without warning. Margaret did not hear it directly. She learned about it later through a message forwarded by someone she barely knew. A brief clip, a room full of people rising to their feet. Her name spoken with reverence rather than familiarity. She watched the video once, then turned her phone face down on the table. The The reaction surprised her less than the absence of feeling it stirred. There had been a time when recognition like that would have felt validating, when being seen, publicly acknowledged, might have softened the quiet ache of being overlooked at home. That time had passed. Margaret poured herself a cup of tea and sat near the window as the morning light filtered in. She allowed herself to remember the earlier years, the subtle erosion of relevance, the way her opinions had slowly been treated as optional, not dismissed outright, but quietly bypassed. Those memories no longer carried bitterness. They felt instructional. Her work had grown steadily over the past months, expanding in influence without demanding spectacle. She had contributed to projects that mattered, supported initiatives aligned with her values, and declined those that did not. People sought her insight now, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The difference mattered. At home, the shift was undeniable. Her family spoke to her differently, not louder, not kinder, but more deliberately. They waited for her responses. They listened when she spoke. The casual assumptions that once framed her role had begun to dissolve. Margaret noticed, but she did not comment. Respect, she understood, could not be requested. It could only be demonstrated and then accepted. Her husband, once accustomed to her availability, now paused before interrupting her quiet moments. He asked questions rather than making statements. Sometimes he simply observed. Their conversations had become more honest, less performative, not closer, but truer. One evening, her daughter approached her with a tentative curiosity that had been absent before. "I didn't know you liked working this way," she said. Margaret smiled gently. "You didn't ask." The remark was not an accusation. It was a truth offered without expectation. Her daughter absorbed it quietly. Margaret's son, too, adjusted in subtler ways. He sought her opinion on decisions he once would have made unilaterally. He listened, not for confirmation, but for understanding. Margaret offered guidance sparingly. She no longer felt the need to prove her worth through constant contribution. Outside the home, recognition continued to accumulate. Invitations arrived. Mentions appeared in publications she respected. Her name circulated in spaces where substance mattered more than novelty. Margaret accepted acknowledgement with grace, but she did not chase it. Applause, she had learned, was fleeting. Respect endured. One afternoon, she attended a small gathering. Nothing formal, nothing public, just a conversation among people deeply engaged in meaningful work. She spoke briefly, thoughtfully, then listened. When she finished, the room fell into a reflective silence. Not admiration, consideration. Later, someone thanked her, not for her accomplishments, but for her clarity. Margaret walked home with a quiet sense of alignment. This was the life she had chosen. At home, she found the house unusually calm. Her husband sat reading in the living room. He looked up as she entered, then set the book aside. "You seem settled," he observed. Margaret considered the word. "Yes," she said, "I am." He nodded, then hesitated. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying before." Margaret met his gaze. "I didn't either," she replied. The admission lingered between them, not as regret, but as understanding. Margaret did not seek apologies. She sought presence. In the weeks that followed, she continued to shape her days with intention. She worked when the work mattered. She rested when it did not. She declined engagements that demanded performance over purpose. Her family adapted further, learning that her time was no longer assumed, but offered. The transformation was not dramatic. It was quiet and permanent. Margaret understood now that dignity was not something reclaimed in a single moment. It was cultivated through a series of choices, each one reinforcing the last. She had chosen herself, not in defiance, not in bitterness, but in alignment. When people spoke her name now, it carried weight because it was attached to substance. When her family looked at her, they saw not availability, but presence. Margaret accepted both without attachment. She had built a life where respect replaced applause, and she had no intention of trading it back. The understanding did not arrive all at once. It came gradually in the spaces where assumption once lived. Margaret noticed it first in the pauses, the way conversations slowed when she entered a room, the way decisions waited for her presence instead of proceeding around it, the subtle recalibration of attention that did not ask for permission. She did not comment on the change. She allowed it to exist. One evening, the family gathered without occasion. No celebration, no urgency, just the unplanned convergence of shared space. Margaret sat at the edge of the table, listening more than speaking. Her husband cleared his throat. "I was asked about you today," he said. Margaret looked up, attentive but unexpectant. "They wanted to know how you manage everything," he continued. "How you stay steady." The word lingered. Margaret smiled faintly. "I don't manage everything," she said. "I choose carefully." The response settled quietly into the room. Her daughter studied her for a moment, then spoke. "I didn't realize how much you had stepped back," she admitted. "I thought you were just comfortable." Margaret considered the phrasing. "I was becoming invisible," she said calmly. "There's a difference." No accusation accompanied the statement, only clarity. Her son shifted in his chair. "We never meant for that to happen." Margaret met his gaze evenly. Intent doesn't always prevent impact. The honesty carried weight, but not blame. Silence followed, not awkward, but reflective. Margaret allowed it. She had learned that understanding could not be forced. It emerged when space was given for it to form. Later that evening, her husband joined her in the quiet of the living room. He did not speak immediately. He simply sat present. "I see you differently now," he said finally. Margaret nodded. "So do I." The admission surprised him. She continued gently. "I didn't realize how much of myself I had been offering without being asked." He absorbed the words without defensiveness. "I don't want you to disappear again," he said. Margaret met his gaze calmly. "Then don't expect me to." The exchange marked a turning point, not dramatic, not emotional, honest. In the days that followed, the family adjusted more consciously. They asked before assuming. They listened before responding. They noticed when Margaret withdrew and respected it. The shift was not perfect, but it was real. Margaret's work continued steadily, unchanged by the family's awakening. She did not expand it to accommodate their recognition. She did not reduce it to appease them. She simply continued. One afternoon, her daughter asked to join her for a walk. The request carried no agenda. They walked quietly at first. "I thought relevance faded with age," her daughter said, eventually. "I didn't realize it could deepen." Margaret smiled softly, "Only if you let it." The conversation stayed with her daughter long after the walk ended. Margaret understood then that the understanding she had waited for, not consciously, but quietly, had finally arrived. Not as apology, not as validation, but as recognition. Her family no longer viewed her as a role. They saw her as a person. That night, Margaret returned to her study and reviewed her recent work. Satisfaction she felt was not tied to outcome. It was tied to alignment. She had not rebuilt herself to be noticed. She had rebuilt herself to be whole. And when the world and her family finally noticed, she did not change course. She remained exactly where she had chosen to be, dignified, present, uncompromised. Margaret woke before dawn, as she often did now. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt intentional. She moved through the house without urgency, aware of each small sound, the floor beneath her feet, the muted hum of the city beginning its day. There was no sense of waiting anymore, no anticipation of acknowledgement, only presence. She poured herself a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching light slowly reclaim the horizon. Once, she might have measured her worth by who noticed her absence, who sought her input, who confirmed her relevance. That accounting had ended. Margaret had learned that dignity did not arrive with applause. It arrived when she stopped negotiating her worth. Her family, now awake to her presence, moved differently around her. Not cautiously, not reverently, respectfully. Her husband joined her quietly. He did not speak at first. He had learned that silence did not require filling. "I'm glad you stayed," he said eventually. Margaret did not answer immediately. "I didn't stay for you," she replied calmly. "I stayed for myself." He nodded. There was no offense in his expression, only understanding. Their relationship had not been repaired. It had been redefined. Later that morning, her daughter called, not for advice, not for reassurance, but to share something she was proud of. Margaret listened, present but unburdened by responsibility. Her son followed with a message of his own, brief, thoughtful, sincere. Margaret received both without attachment. She had learned that love did not require sacrifice of self, only honesty. Her work continued quietly, steadily. She declined roles that demanded her performance rather than her contribution. She accepted projects aligned with her values. People noticed, but she no longer needed them to. One afternoon, she received another offer, different from the first, smaller in scale, clear in boundaries, respectful of her autonomy. Margaret accepted this one, not because it elevated her, but because it fit. The choice felt clean. That evening, she walked alone through familiar streets, aware of the woman she had become. Not hardened, not withdrawn, self-defined. She passed reflections in glass windows and no longer searched them for confirmation. The woman looking back did not ask permission to exist. She simply did. At home, the family gathered again, not around her, but with her. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter emerged without obligation. Margaret participated without overextending. When she excused herself, no one questioned it. That was the final shift. She was no longer central. She was sovereign. Later that night, Margaret returned to her study and closed her notebook. There was nothing left to prove. No chapter unfinished. She had been dismissed once, quietly, casually, without malice, and she had responded not with revenge, but with dignity. When the world finally noticed her worth, she did not ask it to stay. She had already chosen herself. Some people wait their entire lives to be recognized. Others discover that recognition is optional. This story wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about realizing they were never the authority to begin with. Because when you stop asking to be seen, you stop disappearing. And when dignity becomes your foundation, validation becomes irrelevant. The most powerful transformation is not being noticed. It's no longer needing to be. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to @Heartlight Saga for more calm, psychological stories about dignity, resilience, and quiet strength.